As we are in the middle of a societal reckoning in America, I'm going to talk today about Seattle history in relation to neighborhoods, schools, and institutional racism. I will make the argument that we should be working on creating diverse communities to develop better schools. I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood in Seattle, but always went to school in the South End. I went to a public elementary school on Beacon Hill, and then was part of the busing and magnet programs in middle school and high school. Busing was enforced as a means of addressing racial inequality in the 1970s and 1980s. The backlash against busing was much lower key than in other places in the country, but there was anger. There was even an incident where 70 school buses' tires were slashed, and white flight was pervasive. People were afraid their kids weren't going to get a good education if they went to school in the South End. Families moved out of Seattle and sent their kids to private schools. The legacy of white flight is that 30% of all students in Seattle now go to private schools. It's one of the highest percentages in the nation. Busing was treated as a failed experiment and ended in the late 80s, but studies have shown that the achievement gap was slashed dramatically from 40 to 18% in Seattle during busing. And later in life, kids who went to integrated schools were more confident when dealing with diverse groups. And many describe schooling in integrated schools as one of the most meaningful experiences in their lives. And my high school experience was excellent. And I would say that kids kind of paid the price of the past by having to spend so much time on buses. And then I've noted also from going to reunions that the kids who grew up in the CD had closer connections than those of us who were bused. So what I really wish is that schools had been, and neighborhoods had been diverse in the first place. And what's really concerning is that the situation has gotten worse, not better, since the 80s. Seattle schools are 6 times as segregated as in 1990, and let that sink in. And here's what's happening. Wealthy neighborhoods have parents there's a lot of at-home parents, and in schools in the far South End, there are a lot of parents who work multiple jobs. So in 2016, the Roosevelt PTA in the north end of Seattle had $3.5 million in their coffers, whereas Rainier Beach in the south end had 2,000. Some schools in Seattle had no PTA at all, and PTA funding translates into resources for smaller class size and enriched programs. So how did we become so separated? Well, the myth is that everybody wanted to live in neighborhoods with people who were like themselves. But the reality is a history of systemic racism. Racist covenants, and some of them were still in effect in the late 1970s. And then some of these covenants were also sanctioned by federal programs. And it meant that non-whites were forced into neighborhoods that were deemed less desirable. And then redlining made it so banks wouldn't provide loans. Predatory practices meant that there were higher foreclosure rates in those neighborhoods, and it was really hard for families to build wealth. The biggest setback in the prosperity gap came in World War II. Black vets weren't given access to benefits of the GI Bill. And the track from the armed forces to higher education and housing opportunity built wealth for white Americans, and Black Americans' families were for the most part left out. So what are some solutions? And one of the ideas is that we could create programs similar to those that helped our parents and grandparents, the WPA, the Civilian Conservation Corps, programs like the GI Bill. These were the stepping stones of the greatest generation. Baby bonds are just one idea, that all children would receive them but it would help close the racial gap, wealth gap, by building funds for education and opportunity. We need to build diverse neighborhoods. That's how schools will become exceptional, by building diverse communities through equal opportunity. That's a sound plan.